This next section is on the theory of evolution. So microevolution refers to small changes within a population. These are due to genetic changes in allele frequency. Over time, these small changes can accumulate and eventually lead to much larger changes within a species. Think of it like the telephone game that you may have played when you were younger. That small changes in the message over time can lead to a large change in the end. So we have Darwin, who sailed around the world as a naturalist on the ship, the HMS Beagle. And as the naturalist, his job was to observe the different locations the ship traveled and to document what he saw: living things, animals, plants. As he traveled, he saw diversity that he had not seen in England. He noticed that unique environments had unique organisms. And he also noticed that these organisms seemed to fit perfectly into their environment. Also, there were fossils that were found that showed the existence of many other plants and animals that used to be alive on Earth that no longer exist. Most of Darwin's ideas came from his observations on the Galapagos Islands. And his most famous observations were those of the finches on the island. He noticed there were many different types of finches, but they didn't seem to compete with each other. And that was because he noticed each finch had their own niche. A niche is a specialized, unique role in the environment. So, of all of these finches, each variety lived in a slightly different habitat, and each variety had a slightly different beak, which allowed them a special food source. So, because of these small differences between them, they had very unique living situations and food sources, so they did not compete with one another. Darwin believed that all these finches were related on some level and that over time they had changed in different ways to survive. And this change was by genetics, it was not a change that was done by choice. So Darwin used his observations to develop his current accepted theory of evolution called natural selection. In addition to his own observations, like any good scientist, he also drew upon the information that other scientists had collected and come to conclusions about to help reinforce his ideas. So, two of the influences on Darwin were the geologists of Hutton and Lyell. So Hutton and Lyell did not work together. You can see by the dates that they were in two separate time periods, but they were both very important geologists in their own right. Hutton proposed that Earth was much older than most people at the time believed. Hutton said that Earth was millions of years old rather than the thousands of years that many people at the time believed. Hutton did not have the advanced science to back up his claims. However, since we have radioactive dating technology, which we'll get into some other day, it indicates that Hutton was on the right track. However, Earth's age is actually in billions of years rather than the millions, but definitely much older than what most people thought at the time. Lyell, he proposed something called uniformitarianism. And this is the idea that Earth has been constantly changing slowly over time due to the natural geologic and atmospheric processes. So these geologic and atmospheric processes, things like earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, other sorts of natural events, have been happening all throughout time, and it's been causing changes to occur over time. Another influence on Darwin was Malthus. And Malthus was a demographer. Demographers study populations, and his focus was on statistical studies related to populations. He proposed that continued population growth will result in insufficient food, insufficient living space, and a reduction in other resources. Populations increase exponentially while resources increase at a constant rate. So at some point where the population exceeds resources, there will be something Malthus called a point of crisis. There'll be starvation, war, famine. There'll be something that's going to start to limit that population. And ultimately, populations cannot continue to grow forever. Resources will become lacking. So there is a limit to population growth. And then we have Lamarck. Lamarck was the first to propose a theory for evolution. And his theory was called the theory of acquired characteristics. His theory stated that traits an organism acquires or develops over their lifetime can be passed on to offspring. It's also called the theory of use and disuse, because traits that are used will be enhanced, traits that are not used will be decreased. And then this enhancement or decreasing characteristic would then be passed on to offspring. One of Lamarck's best examples was his examples using giraffes. He said that continuous stretching of the neck to reach leaves higher in the trees caused the neck muscles to strengthen and gradually lengthen to give rise to longer necked giraffes. He also used an example of a blacksmith, that muscle development in the arms of blacksmiths due to the nature of their work would be inherited by their offspring, showing high muscular development in their arms as well. Unfortunately, Lamarck's theory of acquired characteristics was eventually rejected as information on genetics was discovered. So this is a perfect example of a theory that had to be rejected as soon as new information was found that discredited the theory. So once genetics was understood, people realized that you cannot pass acquired characteristics onto your offspring. You can only pass inherited or genetically based characteristics. So with Lamarck's theory being rejected, that's when Darwin came with his ideas and proposed a more understandable theory that took into account all these new pieces of information. So Darwin had the idea of variations, and variations are genetic differences caused by random mutations. The key is genetic. And variations begin as random mutations, that there's a difference in some organisms compared to others because their DNA has a difference. Adaptations are advantageous variations that help an organism to survive. Now, whether or not a trait is an adaptation depends upon the environment. If the variation allows the organism a better survival chance, it's then considered an adaptation. If it's just a difference but does not give any sort of survival advantage, then it's just a variation. So here's an example in terms of rabbits. White is only an adaptation if the animal lives in a white, snowy environment. Whereas brown is an adaptation if the animal lives in a dark, soil-colored or terrestrial environment. However, if the variation does not have a benefit in the environment, it's not an adaptation. So if we have a dark rabbit in a white environment, that's not an adaptation because it is less camouflaged, more easily seen by predators. Same with a white rabbit being in a terrestrial environment. Another idea of Darwin's was the struggle for existence. This is the idea that there's not enough resources for populations to continue to grow. they will have at some point a point of crisis where the population does not have enough resources to continue to grow. Fitness are those traits or those organisms that have helpful trait variations will survive over those without. So fitness is not how healthy an individual is, but rather how well it fits into the environment. And the better it fits, the better it will have at surviving. So then Darwin put all these ideas together to come up with his theory of natural selection. So more organisms are produced than can survive. The survival depends on an organism's adaptations in the environment in which they live. Those who are strongest survive. And we're not talking just about physical strength. It could be anatomical, physiological, or behavioral strength. So basically, we're talking about an individual's strength comes from how well it fits into its environment. So it's also been called the survival of the fittest because organisms that fit into their environment survive and produce more offspring. Those who do not fit do not survive and or do not produce as many offspring. This results in descent with modification. Beneficial traits are passed on and increase their allele frequency in the gene pool. Less beneficial traits are less likely to be passed on and thus reduce their frequency in the gene pool. So over time, the population will start to look different. Darwin's theory of natural selection is modeled after artificial selection. Artificial selection is also called selective breeding. In this case, nature provides the genetic variation. We still see differences between organisms. But humans, rather than the environment, select which organisms breed. So humans choose the parental organisms with the desired traits that they want in their offspring, hoping that the offspring that are produced will be more likely to have those traits. So natural selection versus artificial selection, they both start with variation in the population, and that trait must be heritable. But in natural selection, it depends on the environment. So population growth will depend on the environment. With artificial selection, it all is determined by the organisms that humans allow to mate. An example of artificial selection is with purebred dogs. Different types of dogs have been bred over tens of thousands of years to have certain traits that their owners wanted them to have. And here's an example of poodles and then breeding to produce teacup poodles. Not just animals are used in selective breeding, but also plants for different kinds of vegetables. So in conclusion, Darwin's theory of natural selection states that organisms do not change to fit into the environment. Instead, random mutations, which are genetic changes, allow some organisms to survive better than others. Alfred Russel Wallace also developed ideas about natural selection during an Indonesian expedition. This occurred in the 1850s, 20 years after Darwin had been the naturalist on the Beagle. By 1858, Wallace came to the conclusion that living things evolved through inherited adaptations to their environment, very similar to what Darwin had said. Wallace wrote a paper on his theory and sent it to Darwin, who was his mentor, to peer review. When Darwin saw what Wallace's ideas were, it prompted him to act on his own ideas. And so he published a joint paper with Wallace in 1858 and then went on to publish his own book on the origin of species, which then overshadowed Wallace's ideas. And so Darwin gets a majority of the credit, even though Alfred Russel Wallace came up with some of the same ideas. And so then these are just some comparisons of the two theories of evolution, so it's easier to visualize how Darwin and Lamarck's theories are different. And if you have not watched this video on the explanation of natural selection, be sure that you take the time to watch it.